there a place I can see the time? Is there a place I can see the time? I don't know. Will someone tell me when to start? Will someone tell me when to start? No. Where's the one? Good morning. My name is Ming Robinson, and I'm a Dickinson. I'm a student at Dickinson College. We begin by acknowledging that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples who lived on these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School beginning in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of Dickinson College, I welcome you to our symposium, Science-Based Choices for Climate Action, Insights to the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. Our audience includes those who are physically present here with us on campus. We also have a virtual audience of over 2,700 people who are watching the live stream across the United States and 50 other countries, and maybe a few from our residence halls on campus. Thank you for joining us to participate in this event. There will be an opportunity for members to ask questions during this session. You are welcome to ask questions at that time. Members of the virtual audience may ask questions by typing your question into the live stream chat. Dickinson College welcomes differences of opinions expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior and harassment will not be tolerated. At this time, I ask you to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the case of an emergency, please note that the handicap accessibility exits are located on the west side of the building. In this opening session of the symposium, we will hear from President John E. Jones of Dickinson College, Dr. Hoesung Lee, the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Neil Leary, director of Dickinson's Center for Sustainability Education and chair of the symposium. Their opening remarks will be followed by the panel discussion that will set the stage for their symposium, exploring what climate change means from local perspectives. Participating in the panel are Aisha Rodriguez, Dickinson class of 2022, Greg Czarnecki of Pennsylvania's Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Christopher Nafe of Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection, and Shultz, Mayor of Carlisle. I invite you to read the biographies of each of these panelists, which are posted on the Symposium website. I am honored to be here in front of you for the opening session of this huge event. I've had the chance to work for the Center for Sustainability Education over the summer and watch the development of the symposium from a mere concept to reality. As a sophomore majoring in environmental science, I was able to learn firsthand from the hard work and collaboration of so many people that came together to make this 3-day event happen. It's wonderful to see my friends, fellow classmates, faculty, staff, and community guests here to support this work on advancing climate change. And we're grateful for all of those connecting virtually from remote locations. I'm thrilled to be able to attend these sessions in person and learn from global experts and leaders, and I look forward to connecting with many of you. And now, please join me in welcoming President Jones to the podium, who will open the symposium.
Thank you so much, Ming, and good morning to everyone on this Monday morning. It's great to see so many of you, and I welcome all of our guests who are joining us virtually from across the world. I'm thrilled to be here to welcome each of you as we kick off Dickinson's International Climate Symposium. It is wonderful to have so many leading experts in climate change with us for the next several days on our campus. This was a program long in the making, and I congratulate all those who have taken part, as Ming said, in that extended process. If I may boast for a moment, it is fitting for Dickinson College to host this symposium, given that we are currently ranked #1 for sustainability performance among four-year colleges in the United States by the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. We were one of the first 10 colleges or universities in the United States to reach zero net carbon emissions. Members of our faculty engage in research and teaching on various aspects of climate change in the Arctic, the Andes, and North America, and our curriculum incorporates the study of sustainability and climate change in over 30 of our 44 academic programs, to name just a few of the accolades that Dickinson has received. I'm also glad to see so many of you joining us today to hear from our panelists in this opening session, which will focus on the local perspectives on why the issues surrounding climate change are important to us here in central Pennsylvania. It's truly an honor to be hosting this symposium alongside the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 2022 recipient organization of the Sam Rose and Julie Walters Prize for Global Environmental Activism. And we are particularly honored to have Dr. Hoesung Lee with us again after joining us in the May commencement ceremony when the prize was officially awarded. We welcome Dr. Lee back to our campus. It is certainly an honor to have you. Dr. Lee has been the chair of the IPCC since 2015. He is the endowed chair professor at Korea University Graduate School of Energy and Environment in Seoul, Korea. He has served in a variety of leadership roles with the IPCC since the early 1990s and has held appointments in scientific and academic institutes, government ministries, and development organizations that are literally too numerous to mention. Having Dr. Lee with us again is a true privilege. Dr. Lee, once again, welcome back to Dickinson. Please come forward at this time with your remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, President Jones, faculties, students, Dickinson College, distinguished participants. Thank you for hosting this very timely conference especially with inputs from the scientists who worked for the sixth assessment report of the IPCC. The scientists contributed voluntarily their time and expertise to IPCC assessments. Thank you, authors, for your hard work for AR6. This is a precious opportunity to share the key findings of the sixth assessment report with members of the Dickinson community. We hope that this 3-day conference will provide a basis for deeper reflections on climate issues among participants, especially students, the future leaders. The findings of IPCC reports can be analyzed and understood from many different perspectives. I'm sure that our meeting here for the next 3 days will be a mutually beneficial learning opportunities for the communities of the IPCC and Dickinson. The conference program is thoughtful, covering many key elements of climate issues. I truly wish to congratulate to the conference planners and organizers. From the reading of the program, several thoughts came to my mind that I wish to convey to you this morning about the state of climate discourse, obviously from the IPCC perspective. The first, I want to say that there are things that we cannot do anything about, the things that we just have to live with. The first thing came to my mind is the carbon budget. We are to live within the carbon budget. This is cumulative CO2 emissions to limit global warming. For these CO2 emissions, really net CO2 emissions, should be zero, and that's obvious. And living within that carbon budget means there has to be a transition from now to the period of achieving that net zero. That means that transition in terms of our everyday life means energy intensity has to fall, and the carbon intensity of energy has to fall. And the sum of these two decline, the rate of declines, has to be more than the increase in the GDP growth rates. This is a very tough mandate. Failing that, we will repeat the experience we had for the last decade, where the global carbon emissions increased, although at a reduced rate compared to the previous decade. And then I wish to point out that there's inertia in the system and also path dependence in the system. The first what came to my mind or your mind is that no matter what we will do in the next 10 to 20 years, the temperature will rise. And then there is a so-called committed emissions from the existing fossil fuel industries based upon infrastructures using fossil fuel as a major energy source. And the cumulative emissions expected from that existing infrastructure will be more than the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius. That means that the 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees will be exceeded during this century. If you read our report, it says that 1.5 degrees will be exceeded sometime mid-century, if nothing will happen from now to the near term. Now, this reaching 1.5 degrees means that risks from climate change will be very different from the risks we have experienced so far. It will be a compounding risk, it will be a cascading risks affecting ecosystems, people, all the sectors, and also every region. Even if global warming returns from this overshoot to 1.5 degrees, some impacts will be irreversible. You can imagine the sea level rise and other impacts from that overshooting of the temperature above the 1.5. And then there are limits to adaptation. The hard limits to adaptation in some ecosystems have already been reached. You can think of the coral reefs, for instance. Those unique and threatened systems are under various precarious situations from now to until 1.5 degrees. Now, against these backdrops of constraints, there are, however, things we can do now, That is, on the demand side, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 70% by 2030, within the next 30 years, through changes in infrastructure use, end-use technology adoption, and behavioral, social, cultural change. And to be most precise, at a price of $100 per ton of carbon, 1 ton of carbon emissions reductions, we can cut half the global greenhouse gas CO2 emissions by relative to 2019 level. This is tremendous reduction potential. We just cannot ignore that we can have that tremendous emissions reductions. And then we can also take advantage of this increasing trend of urbanization globally through the opportunities, the low emission development pathways, which means a systemic transition infrastructure and urban form, especially in the developing countries. Currently, the stock of the infrastructure in the developing countries, about 20% of the stock now developed countries use. So there's a great deal of opportunities to upgrade and install new infrastructure in the developing world. Just imagine that, how much opportunity for a new green development available in this area. And then all of us developed, we can do a lot of improvement in the transport energy use and also in industrial reductions in industrial emissions, technologies and other behavioral changes, as well as adoption of innovative approaches. On top of these things that we can do, and there are, that things we should do. The first is that we must set aside about 30 to 50% of the land, fresh water, and ocean areas for conservation to maintain the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's a tall order that we should not neglect. And we also should soften the soft limits to human adaptation through removing financial, governance, and institutional and policy constraints. This is the one we can do, and we should do to improve the results of our behavior on the Earth. And the third is a very strong mitigation today and onward for better future climate that will evolve from 2040. And lastly, it is governance matter, climate governance. This includes laws, institutions, strategies. And the purpose is to help realize synergies and minimize trade-offs for various options. And also this governance should accelerate international cooperation, especially for financial cooperation. And third, this governance should be able to shift development pathways to sustainability. Now, this means specifically that make mitigation efforts embedded with a wider development context. Do not make mitigation as an independent decision away from the development context we all know of. And also, this means that make adaptation efforts to be multi-sectoral solutions that address social inequities, and also make adaptation efforts responsive to risks that compound through the interaction of the climate and non-climate risks, and the risks that cascade across sectors and regions. All these things that we can and we should do are contingent upon, may I say, a political will, public support, and personal and individual motivation. In conclusion, I want to say that it is time to realize and accept that we live in a closed system, and time to begin adjusting our way of life and progress adaptable to the closed system. I think that the net zero 2050 will not be the end of history, but it's just a beginning of a new chapter, if it is the history. Now, this is the insight I have from our reports, but I'm sure that you will have other thoughts from reading our reports. I very much welcome your thoughts and wish that you will have very productive meetings for next 3 days. Thank you again for inviting scientists working for the IPCC, and also personally, I thank you again for inviting me to the campus, this magnificent campus, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for getting us off to an excellent start for our symposium. And thank you to Ming for the introduction, and to President Jones for the welcoming remarks. I'm Neil Leary. I'm the director of Dickinson College's Center for Sustainability Education, and I'm also the chair of the symposium. We've been planning this event for nearly a year. It's been a long time. We've been developing the program, inviting and confirming speakers, promoting the event to audiences in the US, and as you heard, internationally as well, working out numerous details for the symposium. We're truly excited and very pleased to have all of you here with us today, whether you're here in person in the auditorium at Dickinson or whether you're watching the live stream. Today and over the next 2 days, we will hear from 50 speakers and moderators, many of whom are authors of the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report, and all of whom have deep expertise on different facets of climate change. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres described the first volume of the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report as a code red for humanity. It is indeed that. But fortunately, it is so much more. When looked at in their entirety, the multiple volumes of the 6th Assessment Report present the latest findings about observed and projected changes in climate, the risks climate change poses to people and ecosystems, and what concerns us very much at this symposium, and very importantly, are policies, strategies, actions, and technologies that could be deployed to manage and reduce climate change risks by cutting emissions, capturing carbon, and adapting to the changing climate. The reports provide a foundation of knowledge from which it is possible to develop and implement science-based strategies for creating a future that is zero carbon, climate resilient, equitable, and sustainable. When the IPCC's Working Group 1 report was released, our prize committee agreed very quickly that this year's Rose Walters Prize should be awarded to the IPCC. And we also decided that we should host an international symposium at Dickinson. We made this choice because we think that it is essential to our students' education, the well-being of our community, and our responsibilities to the wider world, that we learn about these issues, that we share the knowledge we learn with others, and importantly, that we act on this collective knowledge. At Dickinson, we offer a liberal arts course of study that emphasizes international and global studies, education for sustainability, civic engagement, and interdisciplinarity. To the Dickinson students in the audience and all students in the audience, I ask you to consider how each of these dimensions of learning, global, sustainability, civic, and interdisciplinary, are represented and intertwined with each other over the 3 days of the symposium. If you've ever wondered, what does interdisciplinary work actually look like? How is it done? When is it needed? Why is it needed? Well, I'd say that the work of the IPCC, as well as others who are engaged in understanding and responding to climate change, is an important and compelling example of cross-disciplinary work. Responding to climate change is an enormous scientific, technological, economic, civic, and humanitarian enterprise. All of us have responsibilities for acting on climate change. All of us have roles to play as citizens, community members, educators, scientists, innovators, urban planners, storytellers, business leaders, and other callings. And all of us can bring needed knowledge, expertise, and capabilities to the task of mobilizing effective action on climate change. How will you contribute to this grand enterprise? Where will you apply your talents? Ask yourself these questions throughout the symposium and continue to ask these questions after. So I'd like to now invite our panelists to join me at the table. And as they're coming forward, I'll just share. So Ming Robinson briefly told us a little bit about who our panelists are. I'll just say a little bit more. So we have Sean Shultz, who has served as on the Carlisle Borough Council for 13 years. He's now the mayor of Carlisle. In these roles, Sean has worked with community members and others of the Borough Council to champion work on racial equity and climate change. We have Christopher Nafe with us, who is an energy program specialist for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and manages Pennsylvania's local climate action program, which we'll hear more about in a moment. Greg Czarnecki, who I met when I first came to Dickinson years ago, where we were talking about climate change, and then those conversations had to become very quiet shortly after. He is the Director of Applied Climate Science for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and he oversees adaptation planning for all of our state parks and forests. And then we also have Aisha Rodriguez, a recent graduate of Dickinson College, a conservation fellow at the Open Space Institute, and she is also a member of the Rose Walters Prize Committee and participated in deciding to make this prize to award it to the IPCC. So I'll join the panelists at the table here. And as already mentioned by Ming, so the symposium primarily is looking at issues of climate change from an international and national perspectives, but it's also very important to think about it from a local perspective. And so we wanted to begin our conference, our symposium, by hearing some voices to talk about what does this mean? What is this issue about? What does it mean from a perspective that's local, whether it's Carlisle, a state such as Pennsylvania, and then also hearing from Aisha a perspective as somebody who very recently just finished her undergraduate degree. So Mayor Shultz, I'll ask you to get us started.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you to the college and all involved in putting this program together, this symposium together. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of, more recent history of environmental activism more broadly in Carlisle. Going back to 2005, when Cumberland County was non-attainment for particulate matter, primarily because of the diesel fuels, the transportation coming through this county, the Clean Air Board of Central Pennsylvania organized here in Carlisle to advocate to improve air quality in the region after area doctors had placed an ad in newspapers raising awareness of the medical consequences of high levels of particulate matter in our air. And that we have progressed over the years and continued to recognize the local impacts of environmental issues. We're a borough of about 20,000 people. We have about a 16% poverty rate in Carlisle, very diverse demographics here in the borough. But I think what is happening and has been happening especially over the last decade or so, is that residents are coming to realize the effects of climate change, the effects of the increased precipitation and greater intensity of storm events in particular that are occurring in Northeast United States. We're an older borough. We were built out well before many stormwater management ordinances were put into effect, and we've seen increased flooding events and property damage and residents put into danger during some of these intense storm events in the borough. We're also in an area that has a lot of karst topography, which along with that brings increased sinkholes due to these intense rain events, and our residents are seeing the effects of that. So our residents and our leaders here in Carlisle have become more acutely aware of how these global issues affect us very locally. Now, as a local government in Pennsylvania, we have some obstacles to overcome. One, we're a very small piece of this puzzle in a state of over 2,500 local governments. Municipalities that tend to have greater political will to deal with these issues also tend to be the ones that are more urban, have tax base growth issues and socioeconomic impediments that limit funding available to implement local solutions. There are also limits to our jurisdiction and legal authority. We are preempted, for instance, from most regulation of utilities, and the state legislature has, over the past several years, on several occasions, sought to further limit municipal authority, such as prohibiting us for a period of time from banning single-use plastic bags, and more recently considering preempting municipalities' attempts to curb the use of fossil fuel energy choices in new residential, commercial, and industrial developments. So there are some obstacles for us to overcome. Luckily, we had a partnership with Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, ICLEI, and Dickinson College through the local climate action program. And we developed a greenhouse gas inventory that then eventually led to a climate action plan that we passed just earlier this year. So our greenhouse gas inventory showed us that we have the greatest greenhouse gas emissions from commercial and industrial energy, about half of our emissions. Then that's followed by transportation, which is a little less than 30%, and then residential energy. That's a little less than 20% of our emissions. The climate action plan passed in January of this year with the goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 emission levels by 26% by 2025 and by 80% by 2050. How are we going to achieve that? One, we have a great deal of logistics and warehousing in this region. It's one of our most significant industries in the area, and so there's an opportunity with those vast rooftops to increase efficiency and solar potential by increasing solar installations and green rooftop modifications. We can also establish energy use intensity benchmarks and green building standards in our subdivision and land development ordinances for new developments, both commercial and residential. We'll also have an opportunity in a borough that has very old housing stock to increase energy efficiency. That's some low-hanging fruit. We will improve weatherization of the buildings that our residents live in every day. We're going to work toward electrification of heating and cooling. Approximately 60% of households in Carlisle use fossil fuels, and if we can switch 50% of them by 2035 and 80% by 2050, we'll be well along our way. We also need to educate our residents on PA Power Switch, which allows them to choose renewable generation providers for their electricity, and also to reduce the heat island effect that we have in an urban area like this. Simple things like increased tree planting in the borough. Transportation is more of a challenge. We have limited direct control. We plan to work on incentives for electric and alternative fuel vehicles. We are working right now on getting EV charging stations in place to meet future needs. We're also getting our municipal house in order and doing our own greenhouse gas inventory. So I believe we're going to overcome some of these obstacles. Although we're a small piece of the puzzle, we have our own part to do. There is a greater need for state and federal action, investing in decarbonization and conversion of the electric grid from fossil fuel use. The energy sector and transportation emissions are regulated both at the state level and federal levels. Now, these efforts could have the benefit of reducing our reliance on foreign supply that sometimes competes with our other national interests. We also need to meet the fiscal needs. We need the state and federal government to help meet the fiscal needs of local governments. And so I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to overcome these obstacles. We seem to have reached a tipping point in public opinion, and I believe our residents here in Carlisle have recognized where we're headed and the action that we must take.
All right. Thank you very much, Mayor. Chris?
Okay, thank you. Well, you just heard a pretty good advertisement for my program a moment ago. I'm Christopher Nafe. I work in the Energy Programs Office at DEP, and my role is to manage the Local Climate Action Program, which we refer to as LCAP. It is one of the programs that the climate team, which I'm on, has in place a strategy to address climate change and the impacts on our state. So it's the role of the Energy Programs Office at DEP to guide Pennsylvanians to make smarter energy choices, to provide resources and technical assistance, reduce pollution, and expand renewable and alternative energy solutions. So the specific strategy that I had mentioned before was one of 19 that was identified in response to the executive order in 2019 from Governor Wolf to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the state. Specifically, it was for local and state government to lead by example. And that was what led my predecessor, Heidi Kunsch, to create the Local Climate Action Plan program. So for the past 3 years, the LCAP program has been a Department of Energy funded program, which has been managed by DEP, working in concert with ICLEI, which pairs local governments with teams of college students, like yourselves, to identify the greenhouse gas emissions of the municipality or county who's participating and to produce a plan which sets emission reduction targets and formulates a strategy for achieving those goals. We've had 64 participants so far in the 4 years that it's been running, 54 cities, townships, and boroughs, 5 counties, and 5 regional planning organizations representing a total of 440 municipalities. So as a result of the program, we've had at least 53 completed greenhouse gas inventories, along with 19 fully completed and adopted climate action plans and another 17 draft plans, which are in the works. We're currently in the 4th year of the program, and we've partnered now with the Penn State Sustainability Institute, who's taking over management of the program to train the participating local governments and students. We actually have one of the co-directors of that program here with us today, so I'm happy to see her. It's Brandy Robinson. So in addition to the LCAP program, we also have 2 additional programs to assist local governments with implementing those plans, to actually put them into action. One is our shared energy manager, where we contract an engineering firm or an energy savings company to work with the local government to start doing things like energy benchmarking, inventorying of their buildings, doing a fleet analysis to try to convert over their vehicles to electric, doing feasibility studies on installing renewable energy. One example recently in Cumberland County was looking at some of the warehouses to try to determine whether it would be feasible to put large-scale solar arrays on top of them in this region. So for DEP, this helps us achieve a goal of running a successful program to address climate change. For local governments, it provides support and guidance in identifying their greenhouse gas emissions and being able to put together a plan to reduce them. For students, this provides an opportunity to get real-life, real-world experience conducting greenhouse gas inventories, creating climate action plans, and working in local government. So part of that, so it's definitely a learning experience, and part of that learning experience is getting firsthand exposure to some of the complications and roadblocks of local government doing this kind of work, which we have been experiencing recently in the current version of the program. So my previous role, before I was with DEP, was the sustainability coordinator for the city of Harrisburg. So I experienced firsthand the kind of complications that you run into trying to do this sort of work in a local government. It could be everything from a not knowing where to start from a lack of manpower or expertise, lack of budget, and even if none of those things are a problem, trying to convince politicians that they need to start redirecting resources towards addressing a future problem as opposed to dealing with the sort of business as usual day-to-day operations of their city is definitely complicated. But as was just alluded to with the flooding, when I was over the past 5 to 10 years in Harrisburg, in this region, areas that are classified, for just one example, as being a part of the 100-year floodplain have flooded 3, 4, 5 times, which tells you two things. One is that it's absolutely necessary to try to address these kinds of problems because they're going to continue to become more costly in the future. And we might need to redefine what constitutes a 100-year floodplain. So one of the main points that I wanted to make is we talk about the problem of climate change on a global scale, and we tend to talk about it in more conceptual terms. But it's becoming a very tangible and a very costly new reality on the ground for all the townships, boroughs, and cities within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as well as everywhere else. And I would argue that that is where we really need to continue to focus our efforts to mitigate and adapt to our changing climate.
Thank you, Chris. Greg?
Thanks, Neil. When Neil extended the invitation to speak today, he asked that I talk about the impact of climate change on natural resources and what we're doing to adapt to it. And he says, you have an entire 4 minutes to do this. And so I had to really think about how am I going to approach this, because we're seeing a lot of impacts. So what I want to do is focus my remarks on 3 iconic Pennsylvania forested species: our state bird, the ruffed grouse, our state tree, the eastern hemlock, and our state fish, the native brook trout. And so when we look at the ruffed grouse populations, they've declined about 60% over the last decade or so, due in large part to West Nile virus, which is a virus that's transmitted by mosquitoes. And the climate change tied to that is this. It's actually twofold. One is that our mosquito season in Pennsylvania is much longer than it used to be. In many parts of the states, a full month longer than it was back in the 1970s. The second piece is that we have an invasive mosquito, the Asian tiger mosquito, that is also carrying West Nile virus. Now, in addition to being a vector for West Nile, that Asian tiger mosquito is also a vector for dengue fever, chikungunya virus, and a bunch of others, so there's obviously a human health impact here as well. So what our Pennsylvania Game Commission has done to help address this is developed an online GIS-based tool that private forest landowners or land managers can use to identify areas where the West Nile virus risk is lower, and that has very heavy protective cover and a good diversity of food sources. So those are areas where you would kind of put your conservation and forest restoration work to play. Now, in terms of the eastern hemlock, our state tree, has been beset by the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's an invasive insect, which historically was held to the southern part of the state because it doesn't like really cold winter temperatures. But we're not getting really cold winter temperatures like we used to. So that hemlock woolly adelgid has moved to the north and to the west, so that now only 3 counties in the state don't have that pest. So we're losing hemlocks across the state, which is bad in itself. But the important thing to recognize is that it is those hemlocks that shade our cold water streams. And as the hemlock goes, so goes our state fish, the brook trout, because it requires cold water. And so when we lose the hemlock, we begin to lose the brook trout. So what do you do to address that? And there's kind of several approaches that we're taking. One is that we're working with other states to identify resistant strains of hemlock that we can use to kind of restore habitat. That's ongoing, haven't got there yet. That's kind of a long-term goal. Another thing we've done is identified some really important old growth hemlock stands within the state and are treating individual trees chemically. That's very expensive and not something you can do on a large scale, but it does preserve those old growth areas. And the third thing we're doing is identifying tree species that potentially could fill that ecological niche of the hemlock, while at the same time being species that could withstand future climate impacts. So that's what we're doing for the hemlock, and obviously that's going to help the brook trout as well. But another thing we're doing is in the department that I'm in, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, we have over 2 million acres of state forests, 124 state parks. We have a lot of infrastructure, and that infrastructure includes culverts. We have almost 1,000 culverts on our state lands, and a culvert, as you probably know, is just a pipe, and there's a road that goes over top of it. And over time, as the water flows through that pipe, it kind of erodes the downstream area so that pipe perches above the bottom of the stream so the stream doesn't really connect. So what we've taken to doing is changing our culvert design. Our culverts were historically based on a 25-year flood. In one of our state forests, the Loyalsock State Forest, we had 3 500-year rain events in 3 years. So our new culverts are now designed to withstand 100-year floods, and most importantly, they're bottomless. So they will never perch above the stream, so you connect aquatic habitat. So that means those brook trout and other cold water aquatic species can now move upstream looking for colder water as needed. So those are a few examples of how we're addressing the impacts of climate change on our natural resources. Some of them, none of them are perfect. Some of them are short-term, some of them are long-term, but it does show you that there are solutions to these problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Aisha?
Just to quickly reintroduce myself, my name is Aisha Rodriguez, and I was a recent graduate from the class of 2022. And my position here on this panel is a bit different from those who have just spoken. But I would just like to share, I guess, my reflections and my experience as someone that can relate to you all as a recent student. So when thinking about equitable outcomes and equitable climate actions, it is very important that we think about how do we act in a way that is including environmental justice. And I think as students, we often can get caught up in thinking of this primarily or solely in an international lens. And this is extremely significant given the different levels of the ways that we are experiencing or feeling the effects of climate change in non-Western nations in particular. However, it is extremely important that we also consider what are the disparities that are here in the U.S., particularly in our own backyard, such as Carlisle. We can see here in Carlisle the legacies of redlining through racial segregation in the community, which can impact things such as food security, food sovereignty, access to green spaces, etc., which all impact the community's resiliency level. And when thinking about this, I think it's very important as students who are, in Carlisle for about 4 years, how can we be active participants in this community? Something that I was told very recently that was extremely impactful for me is that every community is local to someone. And while that might sound simple, I think it's important to consider how do we become active participants in either communities that we're temporarily residing in or in the places that we call home. To give a little more context about who I am, one of the places that I call home is Puerto Rico, which is a small Caribbean island that is facing a lot of hardships due to climate change and increased natural disasters, specifically hurricanes, as many of you may know. And we're also facing further calamities due to a lack of structural support, poor energy grid, and due to the intricacies of being a U.S. territory. And while people in Puerto Rico are suffering greatly due to these problems, one thing that I love about our community is that people will always gather and fight for a more just, sustainable future. And I will keep my tangent about Puerto Rico short, but I share this to say that you do not necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Local communities are fighting for more equitable climate action already. And with that, I urge you all to get involved with local government, local organizations here in Carlisle, and beyond in the places that you call home to make an impact. It is so easy to get caught up and feel a very fatalistic view of thinking that we cannot do something, and it's also very easy to fall into the view that we need to fix everything at once. And we can meet somewhere in the middle because people are already doing this work and working very hard, as you can see from everyone that's spoken so far. So I urge you all to get involved, and going beyond an individual basis, we can really make an impact. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Aisha, for sharing that important perspective. So we have a very short amount of time here to take some questions. But if somebody would like to ask a question, we have our mic runners over here. Raise your hand so they can see you. If you have a question, put your hand up and then wait for a microphone to be brought to you. And if you're watching online, the live stream, you can type questions into the chat and we'll look for those as well.
Thank you. I had a question for Chris. You mentioned using students and pairing with local government. Is there a program to help the students afterwards to find jobs or anything like that, just to continue on?
There's not something that we currently have specifically for that, although that's not a bad idea. And we are actually in the process of, next month we're going to do a meeting within our office and to discuss the future of what we're looking to do with our programs and potential applications for some of the funding that's going to be coming down from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as well as the IRA.
Do we have another question? Yes.
My question is, why does climate change matter for the people of Pennsylvania specifically, and what are some local actions that are moving forward in Pennsylvania?
All right, who would like to take a first shot at that? Maybe more than one of you might want to try to answer that question.
Well, I felt like I tried to address some of that in my comments very specifically. I mean, and I think as a number of us have spoken to, there are very direct impacts that our residents here in Carlisle and throughout the Commonwealth are feeling, and maybe more of a state perspective might be helpful on this question.
Well, the issue with that is I feel like I'd have to give you a list. So like there's a lot of different cities and townships that we've worked with that have started taking action based on the plans that they've created from working with us. One example I can just give you, recently I was at the Environmental Advisory Council meeting for the borough that I live in, Camp Hill, and they were discussing the percentage of residential homes that they're going to look at trying to target to get solar panels installed on, and what they can try to do to make the increase multimodal transportation, to make the area, like the borough, more walkable and more bikeable so that there's less vehicle traffic. There was even discussion about an electric powered trolley to try to move students to schools. And there's a lot of different programs like that the communities we're working with have been trying to put in place. I know that the city of Easton put together an entire energy management plan for all of their municipal buildings, all the streetlights, all the facilities. When I worked at Harrisburg, the city engineer had put together a program where they converted over all of the city streetlights to LEDs, and a couple of other energy management plans that reduced the overall use of electricity from municipal operations by 39%. So, and there are very real emissions reductions that are achieved through those kinds of actions.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think the second part of your question is, what can we do about it? And I always like to answer that in three parts. First is look at your energy use, which Chris kind of alluded to here. But here in Pennsylvania, we have what's called electric choice. You can decide where your electricity comes from to power your home. And so years ago, I switched to all wind. And I paid a little more than most people. Now I pay less than most people because the cost of gas is so high. So look at that in the way you get around, how your automobile, or if you don't have one, how you get around. The second is look at your diet, because looking at your diet, eating locally and eating more of a plant-based diet, you probably heard this, has a huge impact on your personal carbon footprint. And I always say the third thing is, if this is important to you, think about it when you vote.
All right, thank you. So I'm sorry, but we're going to have to conclude the session now. There are students in the audience who have classes at 10:30, so we're going to end now. There are faculty in the audience who have classes at 10:30. So I want to join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent discussion. Thank you also, all of you, for attending, and our virtual audience that is watching as well. The next session, titled Demystifying the Work of the IPCC, that starts in just a few minutes at 10:30. If you're not staying here for that session, we've got very little time between sessions, so I ask you to have your conversations out in the lobby so that other folks can get into the room. For those who are watching the live stream, note that each session has its own unique live stream link. You'll find the links for all the live streams of the sessions on the Symposium website. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really good job. Excellent. Thank you.